The Spanish Empire controlled more gold and silver than any civilization in history. By 1600, they had extracted over 200 tons of pure gold and 16,000 tons of silver from the Americas. This treasure should have made Spain the richest empire ever to exist. Instead, it destroyed their economy and bankrupted their empire within a century. Here's the shocking truth about how too much treasure ruined one of history's greatest powers, and why this lesson applies to modern economies today. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas in 1492, Spain was actually Europe's poorest major power. France was wealthier with its fertile lands and advanced banking system. England controlled lucrative wool trade routes. The Dutch were building the world's most sophisticated merchant fleet. Italy controlled Mediterranean trade through Venice and Genoa. Spain, meanwhile, was still recovering from centuries of Islamic rule and Christian reconquest. They had just finished expelling the Jews and Muslims from their territories in 1492. The same year, Columbus sailed west seeking a route to Asia. Spain's fortunes changed dramatically with Columbus's discovery. What Columbus found wasn't the Asian trade routes he sought, but something far more valuable. The indigenous civilizations of Mesoamerica and the Andes had been hoarding gold and silver for centuries. The Aztec Empire alone stored more gold in their temples than all of Europe possessed. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, they discovered vast silver mines in the mountains of what is now Bolivia in Peru. The richest mine, called Potosi, contained more silver than all the mines of Europe combined. The treasure began flowing to Spain at unprecedented levels. Spanish galleons returned from the Americas carrying more precious metals than had been produced in the previous 1,000 years of European history. By 1500, Spanish treasure ships were bringing back roughly 300,000 gold pesos annually. By 1600, this had increased to over 1 million pesos per year. The scale was so massive that Spanish officials couldn't even count all the treasure properly. Silver production at Potosi alone exceeded the combined silver output of all European mines. This massive influx of treasure created what economists now call the price revolution. When Columbus discovered the New World in 1492, Spanish prices were roughly equal to French prices. By 1600, Spanish prices had risen to 3 times higher than French prices. This wasn't inflation caused by economic growth or population increase. This was pure monetary inflation caused by too much money chasing too few goods. The treasure didn't stay in Spain long enough to build domestic industries. Spanish nobles, newly wealthy from colonial ventures, began spending lavishly on luxury goods from other European countries. They bought French silk for their clothing. They purchased English wool for their estates. They acquired Dutch ships for their growing merchant fleet. They bought Italian furniture and German metalwork. Spanish gold ended up building other countries' industries, while Spain itself remained dependent on imports for basic manufactured goods. The treasure created what we would today call a resource curse. Like modern oil-rich nations that suffer from Dutch disease, Spain's economy became distorted by the massive flow of precious metals. Traditional Spanish industries became uncompetitive because Spanish wages rose with the increased money supply. Spanish cloth makers couldn't compete with Dutch cloth because Spanish labor costs had inflated with the treasure influx. Spanish merchants found it more profitable to buy foreign goods than produce their own. Meanwhile, the Spanish government made a crucial error. Instead of taxing the treasure flowing into the country, they assumed it would solve all financial problems automatically. The Spanish crown began spending money as if the treasure flow would continue forever. They financed elaborate building projects in Madrid. They maintained expensive military campaigns across Europe. They fought expensive wars with France and the Netherlands. They funded religious projects across their vast empire. All of this spending was based on the assumption that American treasure would continue indefinitely. By the 1580s, the treasure flow began declining. The easiest gold and silver deposits had been exhausted. Mines required deeper extraction, which was more expensive and dangerous. Indigenous populations were dying from European diseases, reducing the labor force available for mining. Transport costs increased as treasure ships faced more piracy and competition from other European powers. What had seemed like an infinite resource was actually finite and declining. Spain's financial position deteriorated rapidly. They had borrowed money against future treasure flows that were now uncertain. They had created a vast bureaucracy and military establishment based on continuous wealth from the Americas. When the treasure flow declined, Spain couldn't reduce their expenses quickly enough. They began defaulting on their debts. By 1620, Spain had declared bankruptcy 6 times in 50 years. The empire that controlled more treasure than any other in history was financially broken. The treasure had created a false prosperity. Spanish nobles appeared wealthy, but their wealth was mostly ownership claims on future treasure flows that never materialized. Spanish cities looked prosperous, but were actually importing most of their manufactured goods from other countries. Spanish military campaigns succeeded initially, but couldn't be sustained without continuous funding. When the treasure declined, everything collapsed. Britain and France, meanwhile, had been learning from Spain's mistakes. They invested their limited resources in building domestic industries, developing banking systems, and creating competitive merchant fleets. When Spain's treasure declined, British and French merchants were ready to take over global trade networks. The Dutch had built the world's most sophisticated financial system, using Spanish gold to finance their own expansion. By 1650, Spain had lost its position as Europe's leading power despite controlling more treasure than any previous empire. The lesson extends to modern economies. Countries that discover oil or other natural resources often suffer from the same problems Spain faced. They experience currency appreciation that hurts their manufacturing sectors. They develop government spending patterns based on resource revenues that may be temporary. They fail to build the economic institutions and industrial capabilities needed for long-term prosperity. When resource prices decline, these countries often face severe economic crises. Today's digital economies face similar risks from monetary inflation. When central banks create massive amounts of new money, they can create economic growth that appears robust but is actually based on financial engineering rather than productive investment. Like Spanish treasure in the 1500s, this artificial prosperity can mask fundamental economic weaknesses that become apparent when the monetary stimulus ends. The Spanish Empire's silver curse demonstrates that natural resource wealth, whether in the form of precious metals or modern commodities, doesn't guarantee economic prosperity. The key is how that wealth is managed and invested. Spain chose consumption and military expansion over productive investment. Britain and France chose industrial development and financial innovation. The choice determined which empires survived and which collapsed. By 1700, the Spanish Empire that had controlled half the known world was a secondary power. The treasure that was supposed to secure Spanish dominance had instead destroyed the foundations of Spanish economic competitiveness. This is the paradox of wealth. Having too much of the wrong kind of wealth can be as destructive as having too little. The Spanish Empire's collapse wasn't caused by external enemies or natural disasters. It was caused by managing abundance poorly and failing to build sustainable economic foundations. The lesson for modern economies is clear. Sustainable prosperity requires building productive capacity, technological innovation, and institutional excellence. Resource wealth or monetary stimulus cannot substitute for these fundamentals. The Spanish Empire's silver curse shows us that nations can literally be destroyed by too much treasure if they don't use that treasure wisely. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more financial mysteries content.